Hi, welcome back to Psychology is a Human Science here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the first and possibly the only one, we'll have to see how it goes, in a series devoted to phenomenological psychology. So, in the previous video, we started to speak the language of phenomenology when we were describing humanistic psychology's research method, and in a rough and approximate way we said humanistic psychology's research method is basically phenomenological in nature, and what we said about that was that it basically has to do with examining people's actual subjective experience of different things in life with an eye toward revealing its underlying meaning or significance, especially with respect to psychology. Okay, so that's from the previous video. So phenomenological psychology, it turns out, is a school of post-positivistic psychology in its own right. So our task today is to describe it and notice some of the most important thinkers, introduce you to a little bit of its vocabulary, but you already have more or less an idea of what's going to be happening here because, like I said in the previous video, we described phenomenology as a way of looking at subjective experience and hopefully revealing its underlying meaning. Okay, so at the beginning of your notes, as we've seen in its most general form, phenomenology has to do with systematically exploring our subjective experience in order to reveal its underlying meaning or significance. My goodness, I've already said that about 3 times in this video, as though it might be important. Okay, so all forms of phenomenology, it turns out there are going to be 2 primary forms, which we'll get into today in this video, take subjective experience as their center and starting point. So it's all about experience, right? And looking at experience. It's hard to overrate the importance of experience if you're doing something in a phenomenological way. All right, so next thing, we get into making this distinction between 2 modes of phenomenology. So the first is going to be pure phenomenology, sometimes known as transcendental phenomenology. And the big thinker here, whose name you ought to know, is Edmund Husserl. I gave you his life dates there on your notes, so 1859 to 1938. So we're basically talking about maybe the very end of the 19th century, definitely into the 20th century, at least the beginning of the 20th century. Incidentally, when I ask you about these thinkers on the test, I'm going to be referring to them by their last names, so you don't really need to be memorizing their first name. Sometimes students get messed up by that. They'll sort of key off on, oh, that's the guy whose first name is Edmund, and so in the question I'll say something like, Husserl thinks blah, 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 and they won't know who I'm talking about. So, word to the wise, remember these thinkers by their last name. Okay, so Husserl, I'll start doing it myself to sort of get you used to it. His most famous work, well, it's a little bit debatable, but I'm going to call it Ideas, a work. Actually, it's a series of 3 works if you want to be technical about it, but a work, let's just call it a work called Ideas. I'm looking to see if my microphone's still attached, a little paranoia there. 1913, so definitely in the time frame I just got done describing to you. Little bit debatable whether this is his most famous work or not. The Crisis of European Sciences is another work that came later that could also lay claim to that. But let's say for our purposes, Ideas, just to give you a mooring point. So the next task is to start to describe what pure phenomenology is about, that is to say, the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl. And it's going to probably sound a little bit tricky and technical for a little while anyhow, because we're going to be talking about things that we don't normally talk about, especially in Western culture, and especially how consciousness operates in order to yield up our experience of everyday life, like what consciousness is actually doing. So if it gets a little bit slippery for a few minutes in this video, you'll know the reason why. We're not used to thinking this way. We're used to thinking in terms of something called the natural attitude, and you can see that phrase in your notes right there. But before we get into the natural attitude, let's just characterize pure phenomenology generally. It's going to be looking for the, and I'm slowing down, it's going to be looking for, and not that slow. So it's going to be looking for the essential, sorry, being a douchebag there for a second, looking for the essential structures of consciousness, the essential structures, the central features of consciousness, as well as different kinds of consciousness. There's not just sort of one monolithic consciousness as such. And I gave you a bunch of examples. So normal waking consciousness would be one mode of consciousness. Dream consciousness, the kind of consciousness you have when you're dreaming, would be another. Meditative consciousness. Abstract thinking consciousness, like if you're solving a math problem in your head or something like that. And there are others, of course. So what pure phenomenology will be doing is basically asking the question, well, what makes a dream in terms of your consciousness of dreaming, right? So in other words, what are the essential features of your experience of dreaming that makes it an experience of dreaming and not just a hallucination, not just normal waking consciousness, not just abstract thinking consciousness, and so on down the line? What are the essential features that have to be there in terms of your consciousness, right? What your consciousness is doing for dream consciousness to be dream consciousness. Okay, so a basic way of putting it is like, what makes a dream a dream? How do you know you're not dreaming now, for that matter? Okay, and for you to come to some sort of reliable answer to that question, well, you'd have to know at some level what the essential features of dreaming consciousness are, so that you could distinguish it from normal waking consciousness, which is what I am assuming you're having right now, is as you're watching this video, you know, with normal waking consciousness is, you know, so you'd have to be able to sort of distinguish, to know the essential features of different kinds of consciousness before you can say, well, I'm not dreaming, because if I were, there'd be this here and there'd be this other thing here and weird stuff would be happening and sort of the feel would be a little bit fuzzy. Have you ever noticed that most dream consciousness, your perception feels a lot more fuzzy and not quite as clear as it does in normal waking consciousness, unless you're having a lucid dream? That's kind of a counterexample. But at any rate, so what makes any kind of consciousness what it is? Now, of all the different types of consciousness, the one that pure phenomenology focuses on most of all is everyday waking consciousness, and more specifically, your consciousness of being in the world. Okay, like how do you ever get the idea that you're living a life in the world? And this is going to become more of a riddle than it would seem at first, because normally you just sort of take it for granted probably and you don't even think much about it. It's like, well, why even bother posing that question? Well, we'll try to give a rationale for that a little bit later, because most people don't. Most people never question reality at all, you know? What is real, Neo? You know, like in the Matrix movies, like hardly anyone, proportionally speaking, poses questions like that, but there may be a value to doing it. Okay, so I said that most of the time we're not questioning reality. What are we doing? Well, we're in what Husserl calls the natural attitude, in big bold letters in your notes. So what's the natural attitude? Well, it's what we do naturally, as it were. The state that probably most of us are in most of the time. Taking reality for granted, not really inquiring into it in any deep or penetrating type way. Well, how do we then think about reality from the point of view of the natural attitude? Well, here's how we normally do it. We just assume that there's a world that's out there somewhere, kind of like in the X-Files, the truth is out there. We assume the world is out there and is more or less independent of our consciousness of it, right? Our subjective experience is in some sense separable from the objective reality status of the external world. And probably for most of us, especially if you're in Western culture, if you're in an Eastern culture, maybe this is not quite so prevalent. But if you're in Western culture, where we have this more or less dichotomous idea about reality, dichotomous means sort of cut in two, right? So dichotomous means there's the objective part, the world that's out there that has an objective reality status, and then there's the subjective part, which is the experiencing internal part. And mostly, from the point of view of the natural attitude, we sort of assume that those two are separable, you know, that the world will go on even if you're not perceiving it by way of perceptual consciousness, let's say. Okay, and that's our normal attitude about the real, insofar as we even think about it. I bet that, you know, 90+% of people don't even think too much about it. They just sort of, why? Because our culture tells us that that's not something that you ought to be doing with your life. What you ought to be doing with your life is working a job, trying to get to the weekend, trying to be entertained on the weekend, repeat until you retire, and then move to Florida because that's the law, and then eventually you die. And that's the paradigm for our lives. Well, it's sort of an interesting paradigm if you consider it from the point of view of, isn't that exactly what power would want you to do? Like, not question reality too deeply. You know, the power is not interested in having you be too perceptive about how reality actually works. Because if you start to perceive how reality actually works, well, you might call into question sort of the orthodoxies that power has handed you to form a template for your existence. You might start to question the whole damn game, you know, if you're starting to think that deeply. So in a way, like, doing this phenomenology stuff is sort of a revolutionary act. But then again, perhaps we live in a time when any kind of thinking is really revolutionary. If your mind is working at all, I sometimes get the feeling, in any kind of deep and penetrating way, you're already a revolutionary. You're already sort of on the road to revolution. You're already a rebel. You're already sort of running against the grain of things, because power doesn't want you to think, and it definitely doesn't want you to think very deeply. To put it in the words of George Carlin, famous old school comedian, if you're young and you don't know him, he said, what power wants is to have you be smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept it. Ooh, nasty professor today talking about phenomenology. All right, so normally we simply assume that the world is out there and independent of our subjective experience of it. Now, here's the catch. It's like, that's a puzzling way to view reality when you consider the fact that all of the evidence that there is a world that is independent of your experience of it is given to you precisely by way of your experience. And if you think like, oh my God, like that, there's something kind of weirdly circular about that. I'm about to have a Satori moment any second here in the middle of your damn video. It's like, well, hell yeah, you have a Satori moment. Probably be good for you. Because there is something sort of, okay, let me say the riddle again in case you didn't catch it. Like, how is it that you ever get the idea that there's a world independent of your experience when all the evidence for the independent status of that world comes to you precisely by way of your experience? More specifically, the experience of perceiving different things, of seeing different things, of hearing different things, of feeling in a tactile way different things. All the evidence that would support the idea that there's a world independent of your subjective experience comes to you precisely by way of your subjective experience. And it's like, well, damn. What the hell, man? WTF? Like, dude. I know, right? So, all right. So it's kind of a conundrum in a way. So, to sort of sharpen this up in your notes. Well, most of us probably cleave to either one or two accounts of ultimately what reality is about. One of them is the scientific account. Okay, so the natural attitude in the mode of objective science. You know, like chemistry and, you know, you go in, or physics, like you go in and do your physics labs, like you're in your core requirement, and you sort of do these experiments, and they end up confirming, you know, the validity of these equations that describe, you know, how physical matter works. So you go to do the same thing basically in your chemistry class, and you find out that PV does indeed equal nRT. That's the ideal gas law, 1834, if memory serves correctly. But it doesn't always, because I am getting older. So, well, here's the thing about that. Like, observing things in laboratories is itself a kind of experience. Slowing down to help you appreciate the drama of this moment. Let's say it again. Observing things in laboratories is itself a kind of perceptual experience. In other words, why do I think that's so damn dramatic? Because, like, it's not as though you're directly observing the objective world as such. Rather, your observations are themselves a function of something very subjective, namely human perception and the experience of human perception. It's something very subjective. So really, the whole sort of edifice of the scientific account of the objective world is, in a way, based upon something very subjective, namely perceptual experiences of various sorts, whereby you end up making empirical observations that are ultimately the foundation for scientific principles like PV equals nRT, or F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration, or energy, or E equals mc squared. Okay, so energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, so, and etc. All right? It's all based upon your consciousness operating in a certain way. Normally, we don't think that, okay? The normal way we think is a function of that natural attitude assumption. That's what I'm really trying to get across to you, that we just sort of assume, without really thinking too hard about it, that there's a world out there independent of our actual experience. But the weird thing is, like, all the evidence that would support that assumption comes to us precisely by way of our subjective experience. So how could it actually be separable from that? Well, it's not. Surprise! If you're in Western culture, that's a surprise. A lot of people view these videos from India recently. So you guys who are viewing this from India or other countries like that, like, this is not a surprise to you at all, probably. Only if you're sort of steeped in the Western worldview is this surprising. Okay, the second sort of way we have of thinking about reality would be more religious in nature. Okay, so God is ultimately the Alpha and the Omega, the creator of life, the universe, and everything, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, all of those great omni-qualities described in the Bible. I'm going to give the Christian version because that's, I think, the main dominant one in the Western world. Okay, so all reality is an expression of God's will, and, well, what makes us think that is the interesting question. And once again, just like in the case of science, it's only because we experience things as we do that we end up thinking that God must have created everything. You getting it? So it's not as though it's the exact same deal as with science, that the religious account of reality is also based on our subjective experience, because if we experience things in a very different way, we'd probably come to a very different idea than God created the world in 7 days, or 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. Okay, so etc. Right? So it really, no matter how you slice it, it's only because we experience things as we do that we end up thinking about reality as we do. Every account of reality is implicitly, and phenomenology is trying to make it explicit, but it's implicitly based on how we actually experience things. So you experience things one way, and you think that, well, you know, ultimately there was a big bang, a singularity that gave birth to the universe that lies beyond causality, lies beyond time the way we normally think of it, and so on. That's a scientific account of the birth of the universe. Or you experience things in another way, and maybe you think, well, you know, God is the ultimate origin as the prime mover or the prime cause of everything, you know, the first cause of the universe, which is a theological way of thinking about God in the Christian tradition. Okay, so no matter how you slice it, it's going to be based on experience. So here's the deal about that. If we really want to understand reality from the point of view of what it's really based upon, which is our experience, our subjective experience, because it's only that leads us to think that X, Y, or Z is what reality is about. It's only because you experience things as you do that you end up thinking X, Y, or Z is the ultimate story about reality. And it doesn't really matter from that point of view whether it's a scientific story or a religious story, or who knows, maybe there's a tertiary category out there somewhere. But if we really want to understand reality from the point of view of our actual experience of it, we need to do two things, or a couple things. One, bracket, okay, this is a technical word in pure phenomenology, to bracket our everyday assumption about reality, which is to say that reality is independent of our actual experience of it. Now, what bracketing is about is temporarily suspending our belief in that by marking it as a belief. Okay, once again, a dramatic moment. So let's say that again. Bracketing, in a way, it's not about sort of destroying your belief in the natural attitude. Okay? It's about simply marking it as a belief. Okay? Oh, I believe in the natural attitude. I believe that there's a world out there that's independent of my subjective experience of it. I believe that God created that world. I believe, on the other hand, that the principles of science working in a certain kind of way created the world. Or I believe it's turtles all the way down would be another account. Okay, so that might be for some of you watching in India, possibly. All right, so bracketing our habitual belief in the natural attitude, marking it as a belief. It's still there. You getting it? The natural attitude is still there. The belief is still there. We're just marking it as something we believe. Okay, so that we can see what might lie beyond it. All right, so it's not destroying it. Okay, I keep saying that. Maybe I've said it enough. All right, then the second thing is, of course, something you could probably anticipate. Now that we've marked our belief in the natural attitude as a belief, we can start to turn our attention toward the nature of our subjective experience, the nature of our consciousness, what our consciousness is actively doing, how things are appearing to our consciousness, so that ultimately we think we're living a life in the world. All right? Okay, so, all right, that's cool. All right, in other words, we need to adopt a phenomenological attitude. Okay, so first attitude, the natural attitude. That's sort of reality before you, in a way, seriously start questioning it. The phenomenological attitude will be an account of reality from the point of view of consciousness. Okay? Phenomenological attitude, an account of reality and different states of consciousness from the point of view of your experience. Okay, would be another way of saying it. Okay, let's see how I said it in your notes. In other words, we need to adopt a phenomenological attitude, which means turning our attention and our inquiry toward understanding experience and consciousness, and especially how they give rise to our sense of the world and life in the first place. Okay. So now, to sort of give this a little bit more substance, what I did for you in your notes is I tried to make the point that actually, when you start to adopt a phenomenological attitude toward the supposedly objective world, the features of that objective world can appear to you to be very different from what they are at first. Okay? Once you adopt a phenomenological attitude, once you start to question reality, Neo, the features of that world, how deep down the rabbit hole do you really want to go? That's the essential question. Like, once you start questioning the real, then the features of reality that you normally took for granted can appear to be something very different from how they did at first. Okay, so an example, time. All right, from the point of view of objectivity, A second of time is a second of time is a second of time. A minute of time is a minute of time is a minute of time. It consists of 60 seconds. An hour of time is an hour of time is an hour of time. It consists of 60 minutes or 3,600 seconds. All right, and so on down the line. Like, it doesn't matter how your consciousness of spending an hour of your life, because an hour of your life is, from an objective point of view, already determined. All right, and it's determined by sort of the arithmetic of how we measure time. So an hour consists of 60 minutes. 60 minutes consists of 60 seconds, and I guess you can get down to microseconds and nanoseconds, and if you want to sort of get down to that finely grained detail. But at any rate, it's already determined, and it's not depending upon how you actually experience it. But a dramatic turn right here. If you start to look at time from the point of view of your actual experience of it, it turns out that an hour of your life can seem like a long time or a short time or a medium length time, depending upon how you actually experience it. That an hour of your life here is not necessarily the same as an hour of your life here is not necessarily the same as an hour of your life over here. And I remember discovering this in kind of a nascent way when I was a kid, when I in language arts class in elementary school. I hated language arts class, and that may sort of perplex you, as it were, because, well, damn, you have such a command of the English language. But I didn't like language arts class in elementary school, so I was an inveterate clock watcher. And one thing I discovered in language arts class is I discovered how long a minute of my life could actually be. And it could be a long damn time. And I remember asking my dad somewhere in that same time frame, how long's a minute, Dad? And he goes, well, it's about, I remember what he said. He said, it's about as long as an ad on TV. I said, well, that's not that long. Well, in language arts class, I discovered that, man, a minute of time in language arts class when I was watching that clock go around could actually be a long amount of time. And then, you know, of course, after the language arts class, a minute of time spent at recess, you know, when you're playing kickball or dodgeball or foursquare or, you know, shooting baskets, whatever it happens to be, like, man, that went by like nothing, you know. So what I discovered was that a minute in language arts class actually seems to last longer than 45 minutes on the playground. Well, you wouldn't anticipate that, would you, if you bought sort of the vanilla objective description of how time works, because it shouldn't be that way. Yeah, things appear very differently when you start to view them from the point of view of your actual experience of them. Same thing is true of space. You may think, well, that's not true of space. Really? Because I bet it is. Now, a few years ago, I had a hernia surgery, right? So they cut you open, they cut sort of your guts open, they put this mesh thing to keep your guts from like spilling out in the middle of everything. It was very painful, and you know, we have stairs in our house, so 15 steps. I know how many there are because of my hernia surgery, which normally I would just sort of run up the steps without even thinking about it. Man, those 15 steps, that's like climbing a whole damn mountain when you're in a lot of pain from surgery of that sort. So once again, you know, how the reality of space appears to you can be very different depending upon whether you're viewing it from the point of view of the natural attitude, which would say, well, 15 steps is just 15 steps, doesn't matter whether you had surgery or not. Or, on the other hand, from the point of view of your actual experience, where 15 steps could be like, that's all the energy you're going to expend in a day if you're in severe pain or something like that, like I was. All right, so... And finally, I guess the last thing, I guess we're going to make two videos out of this rather than one long video. Adopting a phenomenological attitude is a fairly revolutionary act, and maybe you sort of inferred that when I was sort of referring to the Matrix movies and, you know, what is real, Neo, and all of this kind of stuff. And I was sort of saying things that, you know, most people never question reality. Most people are blue-pilled all the way down the line, like they never question reality at all. You know, and especially not in any deep way. So if you're going to sort of get into this phenomenological psychology stuff, there has to be a little bit of rebel in you. You know, like if your goal in life is just to live like a sort of vanilla, inoffensive, easy life, like this is not the path for you. This is not the path for you. This is for people who are content with nothing less than the deepest, most interesting form of adventure possible. A form of adventure that runs so deeply that it involves questioning reality itself. Okay, a little bit weirdly, the camera turned off automatically right as I said that, so I didn't really get to say goodbye to you or anything. So yeah, so maybe today, maybe later today, as you move through your day, wonder about like what life might feel like if you really started to question the reality that you normally take for granted. What the hell, man? You know, like as long as you're all dressed up and everything, you know, like it might be okay. It might be okay for you to really question reality in a deep and penetrating way. And it might be okay also for you to receive the real fruits of doing that, you know, a more amplified sense for your life, like a more adventurous and poetic sense for your existence as a unique and singular human being in this wildly terrifying and exhilarating universe. All right, now I feel like I've successfully said some kind of goodbye to you. So I hope you have a great day. I hope you have a wonderful one. Every now and then, see if you can question reality. Might be good for you. Might be the best thing for you. Take care. Have a good one.